Hello everyone, my name is Barbara and I would like to welcome you all to our latest Novedge webinar episode. In this week's episode, Thinking Particles 6.2, Powerful Gas, Smoke and Compressible Fluids Effects. In this webinar, Edwin Braun will touch on what are the latest additional features with the Thinking Particles 6.2 update. Edwin will also talk about the thinking.Particles direct particle rendering that is not a given in 3ds Max, which allows for direct rendering of particles as volumetric effects. And Edwin Braun is the CEO and co-founder of Cebas Visual Technology. Edwin himself was once an avid coder and has extensive experience in teaching creative 3D VFX. Before we get going, here's an overview of what we do at Novedge. Novedge is one of the largest online stores for design software, and we offer a huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's need. Put us to the test and come visit our webpage at novedge.com, where you can find Thinking Particles in its latest incarnation, the update 6.2. For more daily software news and limited time promotions, pay a visit to the Novedge blog and follow us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Coming up next week, Urbano Canali's exceptional design productivity of storm and sanitary pipe networks. Last but not least, today's webinar is free and is being recorded live. So if you want to rewatch this or any other webinar episode, just head on over to Novedge's YouTube or Vimeo channels. And now, without further ado, I'm going to pass screen and mic to Edwin. Enjoy the show.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. First, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone showing up here for this presentation. I will show you the additions we've done to Thinking Particles 6.2. As you might know, we have now a subscription-based model. So you start with the Thinking Particles 6, version 6, and then we bring out every 2 months. We think we want to bring out some bigger enhancements, but it is a continuous flow of updates we give our customers for Thinking Particles. So the last big update we had was the 6.2, where we added our smoke solver, and I'm going to show you all the new stuff we have added for 6.2. What you see here, let me just play back this animation here, and you see some cubes falling down, and what we have here is a camera, and we have these particles here, and we have a material that has a mapping on these cubes. What we use here is an operator in Thinking Particles that's called Camera Map, that allows you to use any camera in the scene, like this camera here, where we can bake the UV coordinates or do a camera projection mapping. The new thing we have added here in Thinking Particles, let me just play this through to the end, is that you can now freeze a specific frame and you can bake the UV coordinates onto your objects based on a camera projection or camera mapping. So what we see here is a physics simulation. So these cubes are dropping down, and as you can see, as these cubes are bouncing on the ground and pushing and moving each other around, you can see we can now reveal a picture here as all the cubes, as you can see them here, fall into place. So how did we do that? Usually this is a complex thing to achieve, because you would need your end result, so your simulation. All these cubes are bouncing around. You have no control over the cubes bouncing around or where they will end. However, what you want to achieve is the end result, the camera projection at the end of your physics simulation. And with our new addition in 6.2, we added a feature where you can do just that. So let me bring up Thinking Particles, a user interface, And let me show you what we did, what additions we did to the camera map operator. As you can see here, we have these little new buttons down here where we say memory and reset memory. And it's as easy as that. You press one button at the specific frame. So I press the button at frame 200, where I wanted to bake the camera projection onto all of the physics simulated objects in the scene. And from frame 200, we just grab all the UV coordinates, put the UVs onto the objects, and that's it. That's all you need to do. And then you get the camera mapping from your frame 200 on all these objects. So this allows you to do really unique special effects, all kinds of stuff, and you can use multiple cameras, multiple setups. Everything is procedural in thinkingParticles. It's a very powerful addition we had in 6.2. Now let me just continue and show you some other additions we have in thinkingParticles 6.2. Let me, for that, just load another example scene we have here. And let me just show you this scene here. What we have here is our new smoke solver. The smoke solver we added is like our fluid solver in thinkingParticles 6. It allows you to simulate fluids. However, in this case with smoke, it's a compressible fluid. And it's fully procedural. It follows the thinkingParticles idea of controlling everything through operators and always have full control over the particles. What we have here is these two objects, this blue box and the red box down here. So what we wanted to show here is our procedural way of heating and cooling fluids in space or as they approach an object. So we actually can procedurally cool or heat up our fluid system in here. And let me just play this back, then you will see what it does. It runs here in real time, and you can see the color is changing, so that shows us the cooling down cycle and heating up cycle again. And when a gas is hot, it rises to the top, and when it cools down, it falls down to the ground as well. And as you can see, everything works here in real time. Keep in mind this webinar will take off a lot of bandwidth, so you might see only a few frames a second depending on your internet connection and as well depending on my internet connection. However, what you see here is really when you have it in your thinkingParticles application, you can download a demo version and try it on your own. You get real-time feedback on all the interactions we have here. So the big question is, how does it work? How did we get this fluid interaction, this nice whirls and nice smoke behavior? How did we set up the scene? So let's just have a look at the scene setup. In the first dynamic set, we create our particles, and we just do that with a fixed position right now. So there's nothing special you need to do to turn any particle into a smoke particle or amount of particles into a cloud or puff or fume effect. So what we do here is we create these 10,000 particles at a specific position. So that's our position in space, that's our center. We create these particles and that's it. Also, we have to take care about the lifetime of the particles because you can kill the particles as normal, so there's no restrictions at all. You can use all the thinkingParticles power you have to affect or control particles in a simulation. However, for fluids, you usually tend to control the fading out or fading in and out of particles. You want to control that with your fluid solver, with your smoke solver. However, you can do either way. In this case, we just set the lifetime to as long as the animation plays, to make sure we have the particles all the time there. And we create a sphere, as you can see when I move that. When we go back to our frame 0, that's how we create our particles in a spherical manner. So once you have your particles, and again, it doesn't matter how you create the particles, that's a great thing. We turn these particles into a smoke fluid. And here we have everything right now we need to control our smoke fluid. The most important part is having a smoke solver. That's the little node down here. That's our smoke solver. And this smoke solver has no parameters, no settings at all. You just put it in there, and you can have multiple smoke solvers if you want that. So you can have multiple independent fluids in your scene, or you can have multiple fluids in one smoke solver as well. The next important thing is where we want to actually control the behavior of our smoke is the smoke group node. In the smoke group node, we have all the controls we want. And yes, when you see it the first time, you might be a little bit overwhelmed. It's a lot of controls. And usually when we develop stuff, we start with a few controls, and then our beta testers, they start driving us crazy and say, oh, but I want to control this. Oh, how about this? Oh, wouldn't it be cool to control this? Oh, I have an idea. How about controlling this? And so on. And from a few controls, you end up with really all the powerful features and controls you want to have, and usually we listen to our beta testers and implement the features. And there's also a lot of stuff they wish to have, but which we don't want to implement because not everything is always a good idea to control. However, as you can see, you have very in-depth control, and our smoke solver is based on physics simulation. So everything you see here is based on physical behavior in defects, like, for example, the pressure expansion for hot fluids. So a smoke that is very hot tends to expand, and you can control how fast and how strong the expansion based on the heat is. You can control the temperature of your fluid. Right now, we just wanted to heat up our fluid on our own procedurally. So we have set the temperature to 0. But we have full temperature control. And there's a lot more controls I won't show you and discuss right now, but you have full control over your smoke simulation. The next thing you want to control is how does the smoke look like? How are the colors of the smoke? And this is our next node we have here, and that's our temperature ranges node. It controls the colors based on the temperature. So what it does is we have a combustible element in our smoke. So that would be the actual fuel you ignite. Then we have a flame element, and we have the smoke element as well. Each of these status or possible states, you can set a temperature. So you can say, my fuel is actually going to combust at this temperature, then the flames will have this temperature here, and the smoke will have this temperature here. And this is all represented with the color gradient you have here. So you can control at which color you want to see, at which temperature you want to see the color, sorry. And the same for the density. So you can fade out. This is what I was talking about. Usually you want to fade out the smoke. So that controls the transparency or opacity of your smoke effect. So if we would just turn this to black, it would mean that our color will fade out towards the end. So you have full control also over self-illumination effects in your smoke. And that's also based on the temperature. So every one of these gradients is based on the temperature range. The last node and most important node is the rendering node, and this is also a very unique thing we did in Thinking Particles here is we have a node that actually controls the rendering part. So that's not creating anything in Thinking Particles that will create a particle. It's called at render time, and we grab the information from Thinking Particles at render time. And the smoke render is our volumetric particle renderer. And the volumetric particle renderer is a ray marching system, highly optimized. It uses multiple acceleration grids to get the volumetric effect rendered as fast as possible. Still, it's a ray marching method like many of atmospheric effects do, so you have to adjust a smoothing radius and the step size. We do support shadow casting from volumes. We do support shadow casting self-shadows inside of the volumetric and self-illumination, light scattering inside of the volume, shadow casting onto the volume, and as I said, we have acceleration grids as well. A very unique feature of our atmospheric renderer is you can dial in a Phong shading effect as well. So this would allow you to create highlights on smoke or fire effects. One more important thing is our atmospheric can also act as a light source. So it actually is able to emit lights. So you can control how much light our smoke effect will emit. That's most important for fire effects where you want to illuminate with the gas itself, the surrounding. And we have controls for that as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is the boundary control or collision. So as I said, we want to have the gas heating up when it hits this lower plate, and when it hits the upper plate, we want to have the gas cool down and drop down again, heat up again. So what we have is these boundary nodes, and I have this boundary node called cool and the boundary node heat. And let's just have a look at the heat boundary node. You can see we selected the box 0. You can have in a boundary multiple objects. So if you would create a container so that the gas doesn't go out of the sides towards the sides, you can just pick multiple objects and the smoke will collide with all the objects in this list. You can also select a particle group as a collision as well. Then we have some controls, how much friction we want to have, how much bounce we want to have, and the most important part, the temperature. How much temperature do we want to transfer between between the fluid and the boundary. And as you can see here, we have a heat emission value, so that controls how much heat we actually want to emit. And another thing is how we can actually do the collision detection. We have two options right now active at the same time. We have an intersection test with the surface, and we also have voxels, which is a volumetric collision detection. And just to explain what it means, I'll turn on the voxels so you can see that's the actual area where we start to heat up our fluid. So when the fluid goes down, we actually start up the heat emission way before we hit the surface. As soon as the fluid hits the surface, we transfer the full temperature, the full heat to the fluid. The great thing is by using this voxel approach and the distance, the influence radius, we can turn this a little bit, dial it down, so that will get it closer, much closer to the surface, and our heating effect will start much later. As you can see, now it takes a much longer time until the smoke rises again, And the same up here, it takes a much longer time until the smoke falls down again, gets heating up again, and all this. And the great thing is this is fully procedural in real time. You can adjust these settings. You can play around with these settings. And let me just dial this up in the opposite, make it a little bit much bigger. So as you can see, now we have a bigger distance between the plates. So it will start much earlier heating up our fluid. As you can see, it starts right away heating up, rises up, same deal down here, and so on. So as you can see, we have really powerful control over our fluid and how it behaves. Besides the heating, the temperature transfer, we can also control how the fluid on its own behaves, and that would be done, what I showed you first, the smoke group, that controls the behavior of our fluid. I will just play around with a few controls here. For example, the buoyancy. Buoyancy controls how fast the fluid rises or drops or falls down when it's cooling or heating up. So let me just increase that to 10. That should give us a much more violent bounce up and down. And as you can see, we get a much more violent up and down movement. It's now going up and down much more violent and creates more whirls and more interactions in the fluid itself. We can also go to the opposite and say, I just have 1 as my buoyancy. And as you can see, it takes now much longer to come down. And also it will take much longer to rise up. So you have full control over the gas fluid effect. How strong should the buoyancy of hot and cold gas be? So let me just go back to a value of 10, and let's adjust the how violent everything whirls and interacts with each other. Let me increase this value to also extreme. That's the vorticity on acceleration. And the vorticity on acceleration controls how violent the whirls and interaction of the gas pressure within itself behaves. As you can see, just with 2 settings I showed you here, you have already a nice control over your effect. Do you want to have a violent fire? Do you want to have foggy, soft movements, no disturbance of your flow? Or do you want to have a lot of disturbance of your flow? And that's the beauty of it. And everything you see here, everything I type in here, you can do fully procedural. So you can control the turbulence, for example, how violent the smoke is. You can control that by heat, by proximity to another object, or whatever you want. So you have full control here. Okay, let's move on to another scene that shows some more effects and controls we have with our new flow solver in thinkingParticles 6.2. Let me just go to the pumping smoke example. Those fume effects or big fire smoke effects, you usually want to have this mushroom cloud-like effect, and the mushroom cloud-like effect can be created really nice and easy with our system. To get a mushroom cloud effect, you need to consider one important parameter or control in our fluid solver. Let me just bring up again the setting we have here to explain this mushroom cloud effect. So simple setup, like before, you can create any way these particles. Right now I create the particles based on the surface position of an object. So as you can see, we have a sphere down here that acts as our particle emitter. We use position, and we just create these particles. Right now I think it's 5,000 per second, and that's it. Then we turn these particles into our smoke, where we just grab the particles, assign all the important things we need, a renderer, the color ranges, and the solver. And then we can control our effect. So I was talking about this mushroom cloud effect we want to get here. And this is usually happening because of gas expansion and the extreme heat in that happens to form the mushroom. Let's, for example, say if you want to simulate the explosion of a nuke, you have a really hot heat in the core. It cools to the outwards, and the really hot core pushes inside, and then you get your nice whirl around effect, the mushroom cloud effect. And that's what I was also talking about. That's the pressure expansion. The pressure expansion controls how strong, how violent the temperature of your gas fluid influences the expansion of your overall fluid. So if I would turn this to 0, that means I don't have any heat-related expansion. So the only thing we have now is rising smoke or rising flames. So as you can see, we don't get the mushroom cloud effect anymore. It's just puffs of smoke in the beginning because we create a lot of particles in the beginning, and as soon as we have a steady flow of particles, you will see that we just get a stream of gas particles here. And again, I'm just talking about one simple parameter here. We have a lot more parameters. This is really a beautiful addition we had in 6.2. It allows you to play around and create your gas effects for hours and weeks. I'll tell you, this is really addictive here in thinkingParticles 6.2. And again, all the effects and parameters I type in here, you have full procedure and control. The real power comes to play when you adjust these settings based on effects or things happening in your scene. So let me bring up the pressure expansion just a little bit. We had it at 1.0, and now let me just put it to 0.2, just to show you how important this effect in a fluid simulation is. And now we start to see these mushroom cloud effects again a little bit better. And to get this dramatic, let me just overdo it a little bit more now with 2, we get this huge billowing mushroom clouds now that rise up and cool down. So again, I'm just showing you one simple parameter here that allows you to create these mushroom cloud fire effects. Let's move on to something else. As I said, there's a lot of things you can do with our thinkingParticles 6.2 smoke solver. What I did here, let me just bring that up. Again, a simple setup that just shows you it doesn't matter how you create the particles. You always are in control of your effects, and you can move in, move out particles anytime you want. You can turn anything into a smoke. You can turn it back into a fluid, into a hydrofluid. You can turn it back to a rigid body, whatever you want. It's up to your imagination. There is no restrictions. Here I'm creating the particles just with the matter waves, the good old style. I use a matter waves particle generator. I pick the sphere, so that's a different method. Why did I choose matter waves? Matter waves has powerful controls how these particles are created. I have sustain and attack timing, so I can fade in, fade out my particle creation, how much particles are created per second. And most important, I have a parameter called motion inheritance that allows me to track an object when it moves, and I'll be able to just dial in to give it a 10% motion inheritance. So the particles emitted will be following my object speed a little bit right now. And that's the beauty of using now matter waves to create the particles. But as I said, you can use whatever method you want. And here, same deal. We have our smoke group that controls the particle behavior. We have our boundary where we just say, okay, our smoke is colliding with our object itself. So we don't want to have the smoke going through the emitter. And then the smoke solver, the color ranges, and rendering the smoke as well. So let me just play back this little thing. And as you can see, the particles are created all over the surface, but now our movement or animation of the object creates the fluid, the smoke and fire effect we see here. And it is actually based how the object is moving. So you will see when we move the object to the left, you will see that our trail will move to the right. So it's always the opposite moving direction. And you can see these nice, amazing swirl vortices and rotations we get here and interactions with the fluid and fading to black, to the smoke. Once more, I'm showing here step by step our integration of our smoke solver, because when we bring out one new operator, in this case the smoke solver, it just multiplies with TP. When we add one more operator or one more node to thinkingParticles, your possibilities, they just multiply. You can use this in interaction with all the other existing thinkingParticles nodes. Let me move on to another example. I was talking about interaction with geometry and other objects. So what we have here is a very interesting object. That is, let me just bring up, the perspective view here. So what we have here is a grid, a modeled grid, and we can adjust the grid size by just going down, and let me dial it down to 12. So now we have a much, much larger grid here. And what we do is we create these particles underneath the grid. So the particles will rise and they will collide with our grid here. Let me just move that. And they will start interacting with this grid. Let me just deselect the object. So now our opening of the grid is really coarse. So you see a little bit of interaction, you see a little bit of worlds created, but what happens if we change our grid to a much denser grid now? Let me just change that to, I think we had 24. Let's start with that. So that's now a much, much denser grid. What will happen to our smoke? And you can see now we get these nice fume lines going up like cigarettes, fume and smoke. You will see we have real interaction with the geometry and our smoke solver, and you see these nice worlds coming up and everything. Here again, we add one new nodes, in this case the smoke solver, and it just multiplies with what you can do with our thinkingParticles 6.2. And now let's go even more extreme. Let's see how good our smoke solver is. What if we make it really tiny, tiny, tiny? Do you think we can just get our smoke through this grid? Let's see. Yes, we can still see a little tiny hole here. And let's see if our smoke comes through. And again, this is an extreme setup, an extreme situation here. And I don't know if it works, so we just have to try. And you can see now we get a much more separated smoke, these little fine fumes coming up and interacting with each other. That's, for example, is a really hard thing for smoke solvers that are grid-based. We are a particle-based smoke solver, so we can do everything particles can do. If a particle fits through a hole, it fits through a hole. It works. If you had a grid-based solver, you would need to make your grids so intensely fine that you can catch all these little holes in here. It would just be insane and take forever to simulate this. And again, we do the simulation here in real time. We can see our smoke coming through here in real time. And again, you still have full control, even though we're doing here collision control, collision detection. Let me just bring up our controls here again. Let's adjust a little bit the vorticity, so how violent we get the whirls here. Let me just bring that up to a really extreme value and see how this will look like. And now you will see we get a much more interaction. It's more violent, we get more whirls, more mixing up of our fumes up here. So you still have full control, and it interacts with collision detection even in the extreme situations. Now let me just dial this down a little bit so that we don't get this huge violent thing. And I was showing you always the particles. How about rendering? Let's check out how we can render this thing. And I'm going to just bring up our renderer. Right now I'm using the default scanline renderer. We have created, let me just bring up this as well, an atmospheric rendering effect that you will find in the atmosphere rollout of 3D Studio Max. And when you click this atmospheric effect, you will see it has no controls, nothing at all. That's because the controls are in the particle system in the smoke render. The smoke render controls our rendering effect. And here again, it's fully procedural. You can control every aspect of this smoke renderer with thinking_particles as well. And we created an atmospheric effect. It works with all compatible 3D Studio Max renderers. So the scanline renderer would be fine. It works with FireRender. It works with other renderers, third-party renderers as well. So when we start just pressing the render button for this frame, remember we are at frame 94. So this is a simulation. So it did the full simulation of the smoke, and you see we have full interaction with shadows and lights. So let me just zoom in. We have shadow casting, we have illumination going on here, and you saw how fast this thing is. In under 6 seconds, and that was including a simulation of 94 frames. So after that, it will just render in seconds every single frame. And again, you have full control over color and all aspects of your rendering. Now let me bring in a little bit different theme that shows one more new addition we have in thinkingParticles 6.2. Here again, we create these particles, and we have this pixie smoke, pixie dust, or fairy smoke, however you want to call it. Let me just bring up a rendering of this scene. So we just render this frame as well, so that you will see and know what we're doing here. As you can see, we have this self-illumination in the beginning. The light is transmitted. We have shadow casting. We have one light source. So everything is moving and whirling around and creating nice shadow casting self-shadows in the smoke volume and all these nice interactions. So let's have a look at the scene, because this scene is really has a clever setup. I got the scene from one of our beta testers. Fabian gave me the scene, and he always tries to create scenes in a very interesting and procedural way. And what you can see here is our new layer to particle operator. This is also one tiny little addition we had in 6.2. However, it's so powerful, and again, it just multiplies the power you have in thinkingParticles. What this node does, what this operator does, is it creates particles, or it creates objects in thinkingParticles. But it does it based on the layer of 3D Studio Max. Right now, you can see there's an emitters layer. Let me just bring up the layer explorer here so that you can see what we have. So we have a layer called emitters, and on this layer we can see a sphere 1, 2, 3. So what is happening here is thinkingParticles is tracking constantly this layer, the layer emitters. So this layer is constantly tracked for objects. So if we were to add an object in 3D Studio Max, it will be automatically added into thinkingParticles and the simulation. So that's a very powerful feature, because right now you can set up your scenes for your artists and animators, and they don't need to know and understand how thinkingParticles does it and how all the simulation and all this stuff works. You just pass on the scene and tell them, on the layers emitters, you can just add objects and they will become smoke in this case. Or you can tell them, on this rigid body layer, you just add your meshes when you're done with them, and they will be automatically added to the physics simulation of thinkingParticles without any further interaction from your artist. So your modelers can now add objects at any time to your physics simulation, and you just have to run through your simulation, whatever you do in your pipeline. So it's a really powerful new node we have added here. So what this node does is it grabs all the spheres on this layer and turns them into particles. And those particles, they are put in the group spheres. So all the objects found on the layer will end up in these particle group spheres. The next thing we do here is, from these spheres, from the surface, we born particles. Right now, 5,000 per second. So the great thing now is, whenever we add an object to this layer, it will be automatically get the same effect or same behavior. So you don't have to know how a smoke solver works in thinkingParticles. And then we have our smoke setup, where we create the smoke group. And the one interesting thing here is the direction of our smoke is the reverse travel direction. So wherever our objects go, our trail goes in the opposite direction. So that's happening here, and that's done through the gravity in our smoke solver. Then we have the color ranges that controls how the coloring happens. You saw that in our rendering. This actually controls how the coloring works. So it's temperature based. So when particles are born, they become the initial temperature, so the combustible temperature, and then they cool down and you see the color gradient here. And the same for the self-illumination, which creates light inside of our smoke. And then we also have our render setup, where we control the rendering and the illumination of our atmospheric effect. You can see the illumination here. And at last, we have here the smoke solver. So as I said, we have these three spheres here on the layer. And now let me just show you, when we create a new object on this emitter layer, let me just create a new object on this layer. So it's as easy as that. I'll create let's say just a torus here. And let me just bring down the radius a little bit. So I'm doing now 3D Studio Max plain vanilla modeling. So I have no idea about TP. I don't even know what TP is. I have all my technical directors, my simulation director, and all this stuff. I don't care. I love modeling. I love animation. I do what I can do best. I don't want to have anything to do with smoke fluids and setting up all these weird parameters and settings. So I just created this on my emitters layer. So that's all I needed to do. When I press play now, you can see we have our particles here exactly like our other pixie spheres here. But I created a torus. But still, we prepared for that with the surface, so we will cover the surface with smoke particles here. So that's all I did. I created this object. The next thing I need to do, I need to add an animation, do some animation here. So I will just, as a master animator and modeler and rigger, I will just go here, press the auto key button, move to frame 100, and then I will do my amazing animation here. I will also do my rotation here and here. So that's all I did. I go back here and I play back this, and we see our smoke is nice behaving with all the other smoke in the scene. I have the rotation, everything is lining up here. So everything is really working nice and rendering perfectly. So I just have to make sure that I go back to the default layer so that I don't add accidentally more objects to this simulation that might be funny. And then I just can render again the situation. I'm now at frame 55 and I will see the setup here with our torus. Oh, I still had it visible, so I can turn it invisible. But you can see it is a really powerful addition we made to a thinkingParticles 6.2, and that gives you all the freedom and gives you more power than ever in your special effects pipeline. So let's move on to a different scene that also shows the power you get with having these nodes in thinkingParticles 6.2. What I'm doing here is the same deal. I create particles and we will see a smoke, but you will see more. I'm tracking now my smoke, my fluid particles. I'm tracking these particles, and with each particle I'm tracking, I'm creating procedural splines inside of thinkingParticles. And that creates these nice, beautiful 3D sculptures based on a fluid behavior. So you can see here, we are able, let me just go in here a little bit, we're able to catch these nice whirls and effects in here in real time. So once more, all the particles you see here, that's a fluid simulation. We are tracking selected particles in this fluid simulation. We're tracking here to create these nice, amazing sculptures that are really weird, because what we're doing here is we're using a gas simulation to create geometry. Let me just show you how I've done this. Let me just bring up thinkingParticles. So how do we do this effect? First, we create our particles. Let me just bring up the particles. That's done with the precision born. We create these particles 4,000 per second to create our fluid effect. Then on these particles, we pick an emitter of our cloud fluid simulation, and we create with the trail born, we create our splines. So we trace every step of our guiding particles, and then we create a spline. And down here we have our main smoke simulation. That's actually all we do here is we generate these particles. We use a random generator to pick only a few of these particles in here, and that's it. So let me just decrease a little bit or increase a little bit so that we get less particles we use from our smoke simulation. Only a few particles are now traced, as you can see. Now we get a less dense 3D sculpture, and if we wanted to get more particles traced or tracked, we would just decrease it a little bit more. Let me just get this down to 0.6. That's actually selecting which of these particles we are tracing to create our splines. So I'm just adjusting a little parameter, and now you will see we get a lot more splines. So we're tracking much more fluid particles in here to create our 3D sculpture with splines, where the fluid, the gas simulation is now driving our geometry generation. So we procedurally create these splines based on a fluid simulation, which is pretty amazing. I think that's a nice sculpture. Try to do that by hand. Okay, I think we're approaching the end of the presentation. I have a few more things I want to show you. For dust simulation, for example, usually you want to have a smoke solver to create dust worlds or dust and dust effects. Here we have our objects. We use a volume breaker, so we break up the object. And again, there's no restriction. You can turn anything into a smoke. And you can see here we have these nice dust worlds. When these objects break up, we create particles based on the speed the objects are created. Based on impact speed, we create new particles, and they nicely interact with each other and create these dust effects. And that's a great thing. The fluid solver, the smoke solver, is just another piece in Thinking Particles tools. Another thing we've done in our latest Thinking Particles 6.2 is we enhanced our collision map. So now you are able to use the collision map as well for a wet map. So right now this is our Thinking Particles 6 hydrofluid solver. However, in 6.2 we enhance the collision map to allow collision with particles, and this allows you to create this wet map to simulate that objects or surfaces become wet and they dry off over time. And same deal with many things in Thinking Particles. It's very simple, easy to set up. You have your collision map controller node here, and you just go down here and we have the new wet map mode where we say fade in, fade out. That's our drying. How long should it take to get wet? That's the fade in. How long should it take to dry off? That's the fade out effect. So you have full control over these kind of effects now as well. It's another little powerful addition we have here in Thinking Particles 6.2. Let me bring up another, and this will be my last thing I do here, and then we are maybe back to questions, is an explosive or explosion, 0G explosion. I did this setup here where we have these from the center. I use again the pressure expand function I was talking about to create this nice shooting out flames from the center. So what we have here, this nice shooting out flames from the center here. And I did that scene set up with a high resolution where we have a lot of detail. So I used in this scene 400, 500,000 particles now. You see it takes a little bit longer, but you see these nice explosions to the side, the flame and coloring. Let me just render this frame, and that will be my last rendering I do here. Let's just stop the save file here and just render the scene. So I think I'm coming to an end here. I know it was a lot of stuff, and I only showed you most of the time our fluid smoke solver, but thinking_particles is a really powerful effects tool. It has really high potential, and you can create all kinds of amazing effects you can dream of. So I think it's back to Barbara now, and we see if there's any questions.
Yes.
Or you want to.
Yes. What a great upgrade, and what a great show. And it wasn't just a show.
And I was nearly on time. It's always, I can talk for hours and hours about all these great things we can do with thinkingParticles.
That's all right. We can listen to you for hours, Edwin. Your voice is really soothing. There's we have three quick questions. What new features can we expect in drop 3? Can you give us a small hint on this? Just,
Yes, sure. We are right now concentrating on enhancing our caching system. So particle caches will be enhanced a lot. That's what we have on the list for drop 3. So that will be our big work site, is the particle caching. And we will add a few more bug fixes as always, and add maybe some minor new nodes. But the big thing is an overhaul of our particle caching. We just want to make it faster and better working and performing in a networking environment.
Great. Okay, how about rendering regarding fire and smoke? If you compare with, let's say, Phoenix FD or Fume FX, can you get the same amount of detail in thinkingParticles?
Yeah, right now that would be a little bit hard to achieve if we're talking about hero shots. Yes, you can get amazing fire and explosion effects. The further away you are, the more believable and great looking they are. But for hero shots, we're not there yet, because the amount of particles you would need is just insane, and thinkingParticles is purely particle based, so it's not really practical right now to have 50 million or 100 million particles. But we are working on that. We are looking now into a hybrid approach where we use a pure grid-based smoke approach. However, but that will come in the future.
Fair enough. Okay, last question. According to your site a while back, you said that there will be a new black box sharing area. Can you say something about when that will go live?
We're still working on it. We have to prepare some stuff for it. I have no specific dates yet, but we are working on that, and this will come for sure.
Great. These were all our questions. So I want to thank Edwin. I will have to take the screen back, so you will get a chance to see exactly where you can get thinkingParticle right now, and also 3ds Max if you so choose. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to remind everyone that you can find thinkingParticles 6.2 on the Novedge webpage, and Novedge is the best way to buy design software online. You will not be disappointed. For information on the latest specials and releases, join the Novedge network on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. And don't forget, the next week webinar is about Urbano Canalis, exceptional design productivity of storm and sanitary pipe networks. To rewatch today's webinar or previous one, check out our Novedge YouTube channel and Vimeo channels. This video will be uploaded as early as this afternoon. Our webinar playlist has webinars for every software taste. Thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much, Edwin. Your webinars are priceless. We had a great time.
Thank you.
Come back again.
Every time. No problem at all. Thank you, Barbara. Have a nice day.
You too. Have a nice day, everyone.